Welcome to the international discussion panel, Situating Emotion in Digital Culture. Your hosts and moderators for this international panel with researchers and scholars from 5 countries are myself, David Marshall from Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and Janie Umbach, research fellow on this project and a PhD student from Curtin University in Perth, Australia. So we have both the pleasure and opportunity to have brought together some of the most valuable scholars for this open discussion. Professor Ian Tucker and Dr. Darren Ellis from the University of East London have been instrumental in building the groundwork for this event. And each of our other participants brings a wealth of disciplinary intersections to their research on emotion and digital culture. Dr. Mario Kolemanen from Tampere University, Professor Carolyn Pedwell from University of Kent, Dr. Jacob Johansson from St. Mary's University, Dr. and Associate Professor Tanya Boucher from the University of Oslo can't make it today. She's not feeling well, but we hope she makes it to our future related events. Dr. Maurizio Mori at SR Labs and adjunct professor at Università Cattolica of Milano, and Dr. and Associate Professor Tony Sampson from the University of East London as well. So I want to highlight our sponsors for this international event. Deakin University's Deakin Motion Lab, in collaboration with the Alfred Deakin Institute's Global Digital Public Networks, the research culture that is focused on analyzing the transformative effects of digital life. Also, the International Research Network, the FAME and Persona Research Consortium, the FPRC, as it's known, a large group of collaborative scholars and scholarship that highlight the way our identities are reconstructed in contemporary online culture into particularly constructed personas, both by those that are famed and the many that are performatively presenting themselves via social media. And finally, we want to acknowledge the University of East London's involvement in the early development of this initiative and its objectives for the development of future related projects. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Situating Emotion in Digital Culture panel acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. To get us started, here's a short introduction which just works through what we labeled as our panel title, Situating Emotion in Digital Culture. In the widest understanding, the concept of emotion is difficult to placate into existing disciplines. Even in its history, emotion only became a widely employed word in the 19th century and was often identified as affect, passions, perceptions, appetites across emerging sciences and philosophy. Moreover, emotion is also something that cannot be sequestered into the individual self. Critical to understanding emotion is its etymological link to the concept of movement. It is thus important to see that emotion is imbricated both historically and currently in the relations between people, things, activities, and imagined and real other beings, as well as news, stories, legends, and tales shared by humans and humanity through its many platforms and forms of sharing and conveying. This panel is an investigation of the place of emotion in digital culture, and uniquely is composed of scholars from a range of valuable disciplines. Because emotion describes an array of movements from sensing and feeling to attributing, allocating, desiring, and sharing, digital culture has produced an interesting transformation of emotion. The panel's key guiding word then is situating. Through our discussion, through different themes, we are not only placing emotion, but recognizing its continual movement, transformation, and allocation of emotion in its migration and permeation in online cultures. This panel then is critically investigating the relational and correlational structures that digital culture produces. We will work thematically through some specific areas, and our first one is to get into one of the key experiences in the movement of emotion in digital culture, and in many ways, the most intriguing, the most felt, and perhaps one of the ways that emotion is translated into algorithmic meaning and perception is facial recognition and expression. The screen of mobile phones, but also computer screens, does in some way transform us. And so to begin, let's talk through our thinking about facial recognition expression. And we will allow Maurizio Mori to begin this with a background around his latest research. And then we'll probably move to Mario to talk about some of those other elements that I've mentioned, and then let everyone else jump in from there around this form of emotional curation by industry and ourselves on screen. So Maurizio, jump in now and give it a go.
Thank you very much. I'm going just to share the screen. Now I would like you to show some very recent research where we actually use the automatic facial expression analysis to assess website user experience. Maybe you all know what is user experience. I just want to make sure that we share the same definition of user experience provided by a famous researcher in this field, Tom Norman, that actually he defined a user experience as the overlap between the products and the needs of the user. So when this product is eliciting, is providing simplicity and elegance, and these two things can produce the sensation of a joy to own or to use it. So the user experience go very far beyond giving user or customer what they say they want, or just providing a checklist of feature. And finally claims that user experience is a merge of very different disciplines, such as engineering, marketing, graphical and industrial design, and interface design. Although these topic like emotion and emotional design and user experience are very popular and very discussed on the internet, on the scientific by the scientific community, actually there is a lack of methods to measure this such phenomenon. We have many methods and techniques that allow to assess user experience, but we don't see nowadays a sort of shared and like a sort of mainstream techniques to assess this specific portion of experience related to the emotion during an experience on the web in a digital experience, but also it's not easy to find it in other kind of experiences. I started to use this kind of software many years ago when there was just the second version of the software and the results were not so nice. But nowadays we arrived to the 9th to the 10th version of this software, thank you to the improving of artificial intelligence and machine learning knowledge. And little by little, this software are becoming much better in detecting and recognizing and somehow attributing a weight to specific emotions. These software are basically relying on a very huge work provided by famous psychologist Paul Ekman, who spent several years during his early studies in Nuova Papua, and where he was able to demonstrate that basically it doesn't matter that you belong to Western society or other kind of cultures, because he went in Nuova Papua to study facial expression of local people, and his conclusion was that the facial expression of local people born in New Papua was comparable with the people from Western society. So the conclusion was that emotions are universal. In order to provide all these conclusion, he had to build a sort of alphabet that was enabling him to compare two different faces. So he started to study each single muscle of the face until the point he was able to create the so-called FACS, facial action coding system, where it's possible to use action unit, so specific configuration of the muscle of the face, to recognize all basic emotion. When I say basic emotion, you have to know that the scientific community is not always sharing the same conception about emotion. So these emotions that you can see on the screen are considered as the emotion that anybody can recognize. So the software has the same categories, because the software is programmed by humans and can actually recognize all these kind of emotion. I just want to focus your attention that there is not only fear, happy, sad, disgust, anger, surprise, but there is also neutral face that shows if emotions are not there. You might wonder why it is important, because sometimes experiences are not rising any kind of emotion. So we have a sort of baseline, the neutral one, and then we have the others. There are many models that are interpreting data collected. One of the most famous is the dimensional models, where you have two axes, valence and arousal. Valence is the hedonic quality of emotions. So in terms of negative, neutral, or positive. And then you have arousal, that is the intensity of the emotion, from low or mild to middle and very high or intense emotion. Crossing these two axes, it's possible to track and to locate all emotional reaction. There is also a third dimension that is related to the experience. It's called dominance, this third dimension. So you have like a 3D space. This third dimension allows to take care about the previous experience. The more you are exposed to certain kind of stimulus situation, your emotion might change. So experience is another factor to consider in that. The application fields are many. One of the most recent is so-called consumer neuroscience and neuromarketing. Basically, self-reports have some limitations in capturing or detecting emotional reaction. Matching insight from self-report or from qualitative method with these empirical ones, like based on facial expression, can improve the understanding of emotional reaction. Of course, media tasting and advertising, but there are many other fields like psychological research, clinical psychology, and so on. And of course, software user interaction and website design. Basically, using software navigating website should be a pleasant experience, but it's not always our shared experience. Now, I would like to also remember that very recently, not only the software can detect the basic emotions that I already mentioned, but they can now detect also micro expression. Micro expression are much shorter because basic emotion are providing like a sort of whole guest. When I'm happy, there is like a whole shape, a whole configuration in my face, but it's not that easy that I really become very happy when I navigate a website or when I'm exposed to a digital experience. On the contrary, micro expression like moving a part of my eye or moving the mouth can provide like expression of confusion, of interest, of boredom. They are not really emotions, but they are affective state that can be detected, counted, and then measured. And in this field of user experience, it seems that this microexpression can provide even much more insights than basic emotions. How they work, this software? First of all, they detect the face, then they have like features in the program that they can take advantage. And finally, because of the identification of these features, they can classify and assign the facial expression recognized. It's a matter of statistics. The more the engines rely on different kind of libraries from different race, from different age, from different kind of situation, the more they become precise. So let's go now to this study that we just published on Frontiers in Psychology, where we tested this application for assessing the user experience from two websites, Tesla and Ford. Now you can see the homepage of this website, and I would like to know your opinion, if you like it or not. And then I show you also the other one. This one is the homepage from Ford. And now, not only I would like to know your opinion if you like it or not, but which one you prefer between these two as a first impression, or which one, in your opinion, could be the one that was preferred by 160 students that we enrolled in our study. I don't know if there is someone that would like to make an hypothesis between these two very first impression homepage.
Yeah, someone jump in there, because I think some of us have read Maurizio's article, so it might be good to hear what people think just by looking at a website page that's determining, whether
yes, this is just the homepage.
Yeah, the homepage.
And you are an expert in media, so just looking at this very first impression homepage, which one do you prefer between the two and why?
I'd say Model 3 goes for me. I don't really know why, whether it's the red or the sense of movement. I'm not sure, but anybody else want to jump in about, does it affect them? Also, yes, I think it's really interesting, Maurizio, to have that sense of, yeah, that neutral to angry to other things, investigative. You're just kind of looking at it like this, you're looking at it more closely. We all have variations of how we do that. So maybe we could hear from a few others about the transformation as people look on screens, but also, is it different than not looking on screens? Mario, do you want to come in on this idea for a minute?
Sure,
and we'll come back to Maurizio a bit more and see how we go.
Yes, sure.
Yes, thank you. So I'm researching digital therapy and online counseling, and the screen and facial expressions have a very distinct meaning in that context. I think, for example, in in that kind of professional settings, I think the way how facial expressions work, they have a very kind of distinct role. And I think to understand how screen works in that context, it's very important to understand screen as a very alive surface that also has like producing capacities. It can enable something novel to happen. It can, it has a very transformative effect on the interaction processes, or it can limit something. So in my own work, I'm really interested in the question of agency, and I'm thinking that the screen and of course other technologies, applications, software, social media, they all have a role in producing emotion. So I'm very interested in that kind of a productive function of emotions. And I think it's very important not to reduce technology into some sort of a passive background variable, or see it as a kind of platform for human-only emotion or human-only interaction. Mm. And also, if we talk about the particularity of the screen, I think in my research, also like technical disruptions are very important in that matter. For example, like frozen screens are very, very important because they have consequences for interaction and communication, and they have like affective and psychic relevance and response. But also, when talking about screen, I think we are talking about like visual information mainly, like how to evaluate and interpret facial expressions. But I think also the escape from screen, escape from visual information, that's also something that's very relevant in my study, like how people want to switch off their videos and so on.
Maurizio, do you want to finish up now? Like, I think that's great, Mario, because it sort of shifts things around. And I think it's interesting, Maurizio, could you finish up relatively quickly? Because I think we better get moving on as you move forward here.
Perfect.
But to get into that notion of how we play in that space and how well you recorded it between Ford and Tesla and how these students dealt with it is amazing. But let's try to finish it up in a minute or so. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you can see the results of 80 students that are providing the average value for the happiness. The software allows to attribute like a value between 0 and 100%. Let's imagine that I win the lottery and my face becomes so happy that can reach the value of 100% of happiness. So the software is like saying, here you have 100% of likelihood that we detect happiness. Averaging, so between 0 and 1, and you can see that the maximum value that we can see is 0.09. So we should be 100, and we have a very small space related to the happiness reaction, average across 80 subjects for Ford and 80 subjects for Tesla. Ford is the red line, average across 80 people, and while Tesla is the blue one. So as you can deduce by looking at the results, it's possible to understand that the effect of the homepage from Tesla was providing an emotional reaction in terms of happiness significantly higher than Ford. If I have 30 seconds more, I would like also to show you another thing, but I can stop here, David. It's up to you.
Well, let's maybe come back to it, because where we want to end up this one is how do we connect to industry later. Let's hear from others around these ideas, and we'll open it up. Anyone else want to jump into the themes here?
What's the role of the screen here? You know, what's the role of sort of technology more broadly here, and that technology isn't a neutral, facilitator. I think that's really important, and that's probably something we are all sort of thinking about in different ways in our work and so on. And I think if we kind of think about social media, we are kind of in a situation where actually maybe the opposite is now kind of the case, where we are far from a situation where emotions or kind of things are mediated through some kind of technological interface in a neutral way, but actually so much of sort of online interaction is I would say really determined and driven by how technology already, and social media platforms in particular, how they sort of aim to shape our sort of emotional expressions. And also that maybe we might be talking about the sort of difference between affect and emotion in more detail, but I would also say, for me, our kind of interactions are not only kind of really driven by sort of algorithms and how platforms work and so on, but they're also really affect driven. So I would make a clear distinction between affect and emotion, and that sort of our engagement is so affect driven, and that also means there is no sort of latency, there is no introspection, there is no time to pause. I mean, we might talk about emotional intelligence later, but I think a lot of our ways of sort of emotionally or affectively engaging online are sort of always in the now, and there's no time for reflection, and that's specifically desired by tech. That's what kind of technology wants us to do, and that's how we should be behaving online.
And that I think, Jacob, you've also done a really interesting thing of the relationship between affect and emotion. And when I talk about these things, it's different also because affect theory has been played with for a long time, but you have a lot of activities that are the movement to meaning. And if industry is involved in this, they're already, as they make their images, are already attributing a kind of meaning to whatever we're looking at. Notions, as Maurizio was talking about, relative happiness, or on a scale of something, how we can get connected to it. And in the example that Maurizio worked through, you had a notion of ourselves working through a website. These are students that were in the study, but also, if I remember this right, Maurizio, it was also a double curation, which is the students are looking at it, deciding how they went forward into different areas and check out which car they would want. But also it's the website producing relations that Maurizio's study has come up with and looked at really interesting ways. And that's why I use that word curation and correlation in different ways of trying to connect our thinking in a certain way. Let's hear one other person around this, and then we'll move to the next theme before we lose Jacob.
Could I maybe come in briefly here?
Yes, Carolyn, go ahead.
Curation and correlation. Thinking about Maurizio's example and the comments from Mario and Jacob, I'm also thinking of the word computation, of course. And there's the issue of kind of what role or what mediating effects the screen has. But I think also what it means to kind of think about emotions, affect, sensations computationally through probabilities, and to bring that into contact with these kind of emotional typologies that Ekman and others have offered. I'm interested, for example, in how this gets connected to some of the work that came out in affect-oriented AI and robotics in the mid-1990s. And you have the MIT Media Lab led by Rodney Brooks and others who are trying to develop kind of these robots that learn and unfold through interaction with their environment and through effective kind of negotiation. And MIT develops the kind of MIT Ekman typology of emotion to think about, well, how do you program computationally emotion into these robots that then unfolds through their actions in the world? And it's interesting to think about what can you do and not do computationally in this field. I was thinking, for example, about Elizabeth Wilson's book, Affect and Artificial Intelligence. And she looks at this example and also some of the later robotics work that comes out of the MIT Media Lab. And she says, what's really interesting about this kind of Ekman MIT scale coming into contact with computation is that it creates a framework for emotion that leaves out shame. So the robots, can apparently kind of sense and also reflect back, happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, but not shame. And she says that's actually a common thing that happens when people are working with Ekman's framework. But it's interesting to think about what this means in relation to AI, robotics, or kind of facial recognition technology more generally. What kind of socialities, what kinds of relations, what kinds of digital engagements happen in this instance when shame is not there? I mean, Wilson draws on the social biological psychologist Tompkins' work, of course, and shame is really important for Tompkins in indicating, for one thing, kind of interest, like what we're actually interested in, or what kind of social, political, ethical barriers might lead to shame happening. So I guess I'm just putting that out there to think about how do typologies and the computationalization of emotion and affect, in a sense, legislate for us what can be considered intelligible feeling, or feeling that is we are able to feel in these kind of digital circuits.
It's a good point, and I'll let someone else jump in here, because we're also talking about its conversion from what Maurizio is doing into other terms for what emotion is. So whether it's an algorithmic relation that pushes another ad to us that relates to this, or whether it's some other form of transformation, like you say, a computation aspect. Someone else want to jump in here? Just another 20 seconds or so, but I'll let anyone jump in on this one. Tony looks like.
Can I just say something?
Yep, go.
Just we've had some experience a few years ago of using some of this software. It was like a prototype version, and I think one of the things that's missing, particularly the point Carolyn makes about it being about algorithms, is about glitches. The software we use is meant to calibrate on the face and fix on the face and read emotions, and it really our experience was it was rubbish. And it's interesting to hear Maurizio's beginning there, but slowly this technology is becoming better. Well, I think probably the issue is not so much about whether it's reading emotions, it's whether it's sort of misreading emotions a lot of the time as well. And so when it gets translated in a kind of algorithmic world, it's actually got nothing to do with the original emotion. So one, question its value as a kind of real measure of user experience in that sense. And then also, then you have run into this whole kind of problem about what it means when it becomes algorithmic in terms of misrecognition, which sometimes could be quite, controversial in the sense that if you're supposed to be, expressing a certain emotion, but you're misread to be being another. I mean, in another context, rather than just looking at cars.
Yeah, and one of the things that Maurizio's one works through. Sorry, Maurizio, I'm speaking on your behalf a bit, but it's also
I would like also
a series of experts that played into the heuristic interpretation of what was determined by emotion.
I would like to add a contribution because Caroline mentioned shame, and shame is considered like a secondary emotion. So you remember that I mentioned basic emotion or primary emotions, but there are those one like shame that is considered a secondary emotion because of the culture. So shame is an association of a feeling with a cultural situation. And for instance, in certain cultures, when I feel shame is because there is a situation, for instance, I remember in the Western movies, if the totem of the clan of the Indians was broken, they were feeling very badly because of this happening. And we were thinking why they they have these beliefs. Or for instance, when I was very little, I went to India and I saw a cow eating some flowers. And the man managing the flower shop didn't say anything because the cow was considered a holy cow. And the cow could do whenever it wanted. And of course, I was thinking, why they allowed to do that? Because of cultural belief. So for a computational standpoint, it would be much harder to detect shame because you need to add information about these cultural origins of emotional reaction.
Yeah, in the sense I would say is contextual. So even as I move my eyes right now, I'm expressing all sorts of kind of emotions. I'm agreeing sometimes, I'm moving back from it. We know that it's not necessarily complete agreement. I probably do, Maurizio, I completely agree with you. But it's also that I want to encourage something to be continued in an exchange. So even in these environments, we're always playing with some dimension of curation. And that's why I use that another word where I use correlation, but I try to use it as a word that makes us think about correlate as much as correlation. Correlation being a much more algorithmic sort of expression, but we correlate all the time in all these different environments. Let's move to the next one. I know we could keep going. We could go on forever with this. Thank you, Maurizio, for getting us going in this because we want to finish up with around industry. But let's go to the next slide. So let's take this a bit further through an extension of this to understand this relation between emotion and digital interface. And I want you to provide your thoughts on the themes listed here. So is there an online difference in emotion? Does anyone want to jump in on that? So in a way, we're playing around Maurizio's discussion of what happens as we might even look at a website. But let's hear from others about what they think. We haven't heard from Ian or Darren yet, so maybe it's time for them to jump in.
I don't mind going very quickly, but it's kind of related really to the first question a bit more as well. You know, because I just wanted to kind of think about this notion of facial recognition, the recognition of emotion, and the ability to recognize an emotion expression and correlate it, you know, to this kind of complex thing that we call emotion and a particular emotion, you know. And of course, this is a really ancient human skill. And it's, you know, it's evolved over millions of years, and we're trying to put this now into recent computers, you know. And most kind of recognition of emotion is non-conscious, right? And now, so now with digital technology, we're trying to move into the black box of the soul and try to understand this kind of micro communication that, you know, we probably don't really understand consciously, yeah. And detect and quantify it and computerize it, you know, and I think there is a kind of deep desire in the spirit of humanity to kind of get to the soul and to try to understand what lies beneath, you know. There's this old saying, isn't there, that the face is the mirror of the soul, right? So, you know, this notion that actually the face is in some way the interface to kind of what's happening beneath, you know, and that we can somehow create technology that enables to get into this deep inner sort of being of our very kind of soul, that which is really intimate and private to us, and as if it kind of exists there as well, you know. And when we're thinking about situating emotion, how do we think of, does it mean emotion is situated within us and our face is an expression of that, and so therefore we've kind of got an insight into what is going on at a deeper level? This is what technologists kind of desire, and marketers really want to know. They want to get beyond kind of everyday kind of activity to find out what is really kind of happening within a person. And I find that really fascinating.
Oh, you've gone mute.
You muted, Darren.
Oh, you muted. You did it yourself.
Probably a good thing.
Well, I think that was a sign, Darren, that you were probably playing with the notion of your own intentionality here. But Ian, we haven't heard from you, and I'm happy if you jump into that or even get into that theme of presence and co-presence, which is coming in a sense from Darren's notion. But what are we dealing with? Like, yes, Darren disappeared for a moment there in an online setting. Do we have evidence of how this is a different feel? It is a different sense of emotion, that we are somehow different here. Ian, I don't know if you want to jump into that. You can start wherever you want. Go.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I will just say a couple of things if I can about the facial recognition stuff. I do think, you know, there's a couple of points to be made about that. And one thing I think Maurizio talked about, which I think is really important, is this that we need to be really mindful of, is almost this claim to kind of authenticity. So these technologies that then going for this kind of analyzing micro expressions, as if that's the true authenticity, and you don't need consciousness to understand that, but the technology can kind of get to it in a way that we can't. And I think that's something that we really need to kind of be mindful of. And I think that also then kind of demonstrates how that kind of facial recognition AI-based kind of technologies impact and kind of relate to that different parts of that kind of affect to emotion kind of continuum, if you want to think of it as a continuum. Yeah, in the way that it can kind of speak to some kind of authenticity that we might want to say is somehow kind of non-conscious kind of affective activity, but then also he's also making a claim about it being some kind of, you know, culturally, well, actually not necessarily culturally specific kind of emotional expressions. I just want to make that point about authenticity. I think is an important one. Yeah, so in terms of kind of the interface online differences, I mean, I think obviously we need to be a bit mindful here. I'm sure we all think this as well, you know, that you know, online digital stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. Yeah, you know, it's always kind of situated and in relation to you know, the offline kind of world. You know, you've only got to think about some of the you know, really problematic kind of expressions of emotion on kind of Twitter and online hate and things like that. You know, they're really problematic. I think the platform makes them visible and elicits them in particularly kind of intense ways. So it definitely shapes what can be done. But it also relates to that kind of stuff, also relates to, you know, historical and kind of structural forms of racism and kind of misogyny and things. So we have to always understand that kind of connection. Yeah,
and that,
you know,
that's a good point, Ian, because I think I wish Jacob were still here, actually, because I think there's something where we want to talk about, and maybe Carolyn can come in on this one, I think, which is trying to get the relationship of the self and collective ecologies, and how that's different in digital space, whatever we want to call digital space. I wouldn't mind hearing Carolyn and then Tony on this one to hear where that fits into things. Carolyn, does that make any sense to you to go forward? And Mario, if you're keen on this too, you can jump in at any point too.
I mean, I've been finding it more and more difficult to think about kind of an online-offline divide, given how plugged in we are with ubiquitous computing and algorithmic architectures kind of everywhere we go, that kind of online-offline thing seems harder to actually work with as a framework to understand our contemporary algorithmic condition, if you want to call it.
But you do that really interesting thing of through Michel Serres, is it that you play with the notion of even the relationship to memory, and how we have maybe had a more rote memory in terms of knowledge and awareness, and how that changes within online culture, where you feel as if, and I remember my students 25 years ago saying, I don't need to remember this. I can always find these things wherever I'm looking. And grandparents would be really upset with them at that point. and they didn't quite understand it. And to consider the last 25 years, Caroline, you want to get into that notion of that relationship? And does it change even the social relationship as much as the individual relationship to online culture? You're right about how you started there. So I segued you there, but
I guess so. So we've always been mediated in particular ways. We've always already been technological. But I think if we're thinking about the unfolding and impact about our current new technologies, particularly digital culture, smart and algorithmic media, we tend to think about how this might be changing the ways that we think, we engage, we interact quite negatively. And there's certainly lots of examples we could use to do so. But I think Michel Serres' book Thumbelina, where he says he's talking about millennials, but I think he's actually talking about a younger generation than that, who've only grown up with the internet and kind of cell phones and stuff, is for me quite interesting to think how we might develop a more expansive framework to understand how digital culture in its different forms might be affecting the very nature of thought, emotion, and affect itself. So he talks about how having this little box with access to all information that's not just there, but already edited, curated, compiled in certain ways, actually changes perhaps over time the nature of thought itself. So as you say, I mean, if kind of the advent of like written cultures meant that you didn't have to keep everything in your head the same way that an oral culture would have necessitated, what does it mean to kind of have all the world's information at a click that's already been organized for you in particular ways? We could think of lots of negative implications of this, given it's corporations that are kind of organizing it and kind of ordering it in certain ways. But we could also think, and this is what Serres does, I think, about what that might open up more affirmatively or interestingly for how we navigate the world. So one of the provocative claims he makes is that on one hand, we might say that we're becoming more algorithmic, more procedural, more computationally oriented ourselves as human. On the other hand, maybe that opens up space, to the extent that we delegate these functions to our digital media, for us to engage in a more intuitive way with the unfolding of the world, to kind of have, in a way, to not be taking up so much kind of brain space to have to do this kind of taking in, organizing, and remembering information ourselves, that we actually have more capacity to develop what he calls this inventive and enduring intuition. How do we maybe, particularly younger generations, he says, have the capacity now to engage with the world in terms of movement, flow, affect, and sense in a way that might mean we engage with it differently and perhaps in some kind of quite interesting ways? What does it mean, for example, to move away from kind of analysis or rational thought as our primary mode of engaging, to actually think about the kind of more effective means or intuitive means of being in everyday life? I say they're provocative because I think there's all sorts of then questions and critiques that could come out of it. It's just interesting to think, as you say, about what difference our new media might make for how we are in the world.
Before I jump to Tony, I think I'm gonna ask Mario to play in that about atmosphere and its relationship between the social, the technological, and yeah, in a sense, the emotional construction or movement, I suppose, that's there. And then Tony, you can jump in if you feel like, but there's definitely other ones that you can come in a bit later on too. Go ahead, Mario, if you feel okay on
thank
this.
you. Yeah, I was just about to say that I think talking about the continuum between emotion and affect, I think we tend to associate emotion to individual emotions and individual experiences. But I think, for example, alternative concepts like atmosphere also highlight how we are all kind of, there are collective emotions, collective experiences. And I think that we don't know enough how digital atmospheres
are we having a collective experience right now? Are we in an atmosphere right now? Yes. Keep going.
Yes. But actually, Karen was talking about generations, and that's also very relevant, I think. But it made me think also inclusions and exclusions. Like, for example, when we talk about social media, I think we very easily think of young people as a group. But then there's a question like what kind of new groups and cuts and divides digital cultures produce. Like, for example, if you talk about vulnerability, we perhaps think about ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, but there must be something new also, some new vulnerabilities and groups. But yeah, going back to the question of atmosphere, I think that's something that really blurs the boundaries between the self and the others, and also like between emotion and affects, offline and online. So I think that we all need to be very aware what kind of dichotomies we are producing when we talk about digital cultures.
Tony, do you want to?
I can chip in. Nice way to segue to the what I'm going to talk about with regards to atmospheres. I was struck at the end of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. The whistleblower Christopher Wiley said that we're misfocusing, is that the right word, on issues around kind of misinformation. He said what Facebook really needs to do is understand the collective dynamic on its networks. And I think that whole controversy was stirred up by that kind of old sociological question about what happens when individuals become absorbed in a collective, and atmosphere I think captures that beautifully. I mean, Ian's work, another reference point, Ian and Darren's work with Simondon here, about relationships between individuals, collectives, in technological mediated environments. And what I just would add to that, interestingly, we start off talking about user experience, and we're mentioning marketing and all that sort of thing, is a way that those atmospheres are kind of collected. I mean, Tero Karpi's book, Disconnected, is interesting in that respect, because it starts talking about the capture of data, not just being about kind of the old data double, pure information capture. And I think about Facebook's lookalike audiences, which is this kind of black box kind of marketing, very lucrative marketing device they sell, which was where information is copied about people, even if you're on Facebook or not. And what Karpi argues that there's not just sort of raw information there, but a lot of kind of sentiment is captured as well around these people. So part of this atmosphere is commoditized, poured into those systems.
Thanks for that, Tim. Let's try, if we can, move on to our next section. They're related, everything's related here, but it's back to something that we talked about earlier a little bit about emotional intelligence. We've already addressed, I probably put it out there too many times, curation, industrial curation, definitely with Maurizio's notion of how we make a relationship happen, and especially around, as we described with facial recognition. But can we deal with the industrial similarities and self-collective correlation and curation around emotion? Can we deal with this notion of this construction of an algorithmic artificial intelligence around us? And how much are we taking this on? Maurizio, this is a chance for you to come back in a little bit. So jump in for a moment, and then we'll move on to others. What is artificial intelligence, and how does it actually relate to some of the things that you've studied, and how does it move back into industry thinking? Artificial intelligence and its relationship to emotion. What do you think?
Well, artificial intelligence, it seems like a promising field, but there are also ethical issues related to the use of artificial intelligence. What I can see in my experience, let's imagine when I started 13 years ago, the same software that I showed you was performing in a very different way because of the improvement of artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. The ability to detect correctly facial emotional expression has improved. I can imagine that there might be a system to track the face of our faces during our conversation right now, and probably pick out from the data which were the best correlation relationship amongst us during our talking. The point is, when you have all this information, all this data, what do you do? Because user experience is a field where basically we try to extract insight, to improve, to make the quality of digital experiences better, because often we have very bad experiences with the website, with software and so on. So there is the need to get rid of bad experiences and to get high quality experiences. I can understand that this is our aims, but maybe sometimes algorithms are not really providing this improvement of quality. Let's imagine just one. No? I was reading an article about the algorithm that was able to, the Volkswagen scandal. No? There was an algorithm enabling to bypass the value, the proper value of pollution, and to show that this car could actually provide a very good performance about it. So in that case, artificial intelligence was not applied for improving the quality of humans during certain situations. In that case, algorithms were applied to fake something. So the problem is that the computation, the knowledge has not really 1 gram of ethical purposes. So we can really produce very valuable knowledge and techniques, but the values of the application are in the mind of the person that applies, or in the mind of the person that applied this technology and this knowledge and the purpose of these studies. In my opinion, our artificial intelligence is our destiny, because sooner or later there will be such a big improvement in understanding the brain and replicating the function of the brain, and it will be just a matter of time that machine and algorithms and system can really extract so much information. We have to deal with this.
I think one of the things we were going to move into, actually, Tanya Boucher was going to be the person who's going to deal with some of this area in my mind, because she was dealing with a lot of things that dealt with awareness and knowledge in terms of its relationship to emotion and a relationship to emotional intelligence. I also think that one of the things that is useful, but we don't do enough of, is probably all the research that deals with autism. And as you move into interfaces, how much are we holding on to? How much do we let go of what would be normal emotional awareness in everyday life? Does it shift when we move into a digital sort of repertoire, in a sense? I'm not sure who could come in here. Maybe Ian or Darren might be one for this one.
I can sort of speak, I guess, a couple of things to that. I think one thing is really interesting. I was reading about this the other day. I can't remember who it was now, but anyway, one thing I think is really interesting about this whole debate is this idea that in one area of this debate is this idea that AI has to somehow become an equal with kind of human kind of capacities. Yeah, so there's massive kind of interest in that, and we could debate that till the cows come home. But I mean, one thing that sort of struck me listening to Maurizio there was also, though, that, you know, things don't, your machines, digital platforms don't have to be kind of intelligent. They don't have to be able to replicate Hannah Zevin's, you know, kind of really good book, The Distance Cure, and a History of kind of Teletherapy. you know, she's talking, well, one bit of the things she's talking about in there, and I've done some work in this area as well, is in kind of like chatbots in mental health, whether you can create a kind of automated form of therapy to support people with their mental health. And, you know, there's, and Sherry Turkle's written about this as well, in terms of the, you know, the very well-known kind of case of Eliza, this kind of early dialogical kind of conversational kind of very basic computer kind of program. And one of the things that's often reported there is, you know, that people that used it did find some kind of therapeutic kind of value of it. So this is often used as a kind of think as kind of evidence for this kind of area. But like Turkle will make the point, and I think it's a good point, that, you know, the value of some of these things, and in the case of Eliza, what was not that it was in some way, you know, acting as a kind of therapist or something, in any way replicating what a therapist would do, but actually just that the means it allowed to kind of reflect, meant it almost acted more of as a kind of as a diary or a kind of mirror. Yeah, and you know, one of the things that Weizenbaum talks about with that is that how he, after a while, the people that were using Eliza didn't really want him looking over their shoulder, you know, and I think that's because it was a personal thing that, you know, they were treating a little bit like their kind of diary. And Hannah Zeman has this really nice kind of concept, I think, of auto intimacy, you know, so digital platforms or chatbots or whatever the technologies can you know, this being a state in which they can allow you to kind of address kind of aspects of yourself, yeah, through the medium of a kind of non-human. So in a way, you know, I think that's another important part of this whole discussion, actually, is that, you know, that things don't necessarily have to, you know, with a chatbot in mental health, the debate is, I did a project around, you know, whether there's any way we could try to get this chatbot to understand kind of empathy. Yeah. And one of the ways we were going to do that is to give it, fill it up with loads and loads and loads and loads of what would have been rated as empathic kind of responses, and see if it could learn any kind of textual kind of patterns in it. But in a way, it didn't have to do that. Yeah, it could also facilitate feelings of support in people that might use it. Yeah, just by being there and allowing that kind of reflection, and there being kind of value in that kind of almost like kind of the archiving of feeling. You know, this can happen in kind of online platforms as well, where you can write things down and then you can look back at your posts from the past or something and think, oh, actually, yeah, and I could see, you know, I could see how I was feeling then, and that then you can relate to your feelings in the present compared to being able to kind of reconnect with your feelings in the past. And platforms, you know, and digital technologies allow for a lot of that.
Let's try to move on to another theme. There's a lot there. There's engagement that Tony brought up that I'd integrated into this part, and it's definitely tarot carpi that we spoke about before. And I think Ian's discussion there is getting us a sense of how we're constantly sort of in a kind of negotiation of what we're feeling and how we're feeling. But we'll move into this next one here, which is a kind of new forms of digital sensitivity in media and in platform kind of activity as well. So it's a related theme of industrial and individual and collective digital emotional intelligence and how it moves through our cultures. Are there new forms of digital sensitivity emerging in this structured form of governing by platforms, and our structuring of our relationship to social media and its positioning and placing of meaning in relation to emotion? Sensitivity, I think, captures this, but it could also be something that digital industries want to navigate as well. There's something that's changing. There's definitely could be related to what's happened in the pandemic, but there's a different form of sensitivity emerging that some have talked about in terms of a politics. Again, Carolyn, you talked about a politics that's emerged connected to movements in a sense, and it isn't all algorithmically sequestered into something that is just for industry or just for political parties, but it can have different kind of movements. What kind of sensitivity is emerging, I suppose, in digital culture? Carolyn, maybe you can begin, but and then we'll move on to someone else to jump in there as well.
I think what I'm thinking about at this point is very much following on from Ian's comments and some of Mario's earlier discussion, if you think about these legacies of the ELISA effect and kind of these online therapies that weren't intelligent technologies in the way we think of it now per se, but still had emotional effects, I'm feeling like the kinds of sensitivities that become important today, for example, in kind of home sensing or kind of, biosensing technologies that we wear in wearable forms, just cannot be separated from what Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. I always try to think in more affirmative ways, but I'm feeling more and more, it's just, if you think of kind of Amazon's Alexa kind of home assistant, who in the United States at least now has increased computational abilities to sense the emotional tenor of people's voices. So she can kind of sense if you have a sniffle in your voice and you're coming down with something, and therefore recommend a recipe for chicken soup. Or she can have a hunch that you've left a light on somewhere that you didn't mean to and remind you of it. I'm interested in this kind of digital sensitivity and intuition, but when she recommends that recipe for chicken soup, it's of course tied into particular products and profit generating structures. And in fact, everything that Alexa and her counterparts do now, because of the structures of surveillance capitalism or platform capitalism, are eliciting and producing affective relations and sensitivities for the generation of profit. Whether that's through getting people to buy certain things or the creation of prediction products that emerge from this wide scale processing of data. So it's not just how are we interacting affectively with the kind of program that Turkle wrote about, but how are we being actively nudged, pushed, constituted, and shaped towards certain profit generating outcomes for these like multinational corporations, and what are all the different ways that this structures other types of possibilities that might be emergent or not politically, socially, ethically, and so forth.
Yeah, one of the turnarounds that I thought about too is how corporations are actually playing in emotional spaces way more than they've done in the past, and also dealing with issues of gender politics, issues of all sorts of other things, and positioning their corporations within that, recognizing that they're going to lose, definitely fractions of the population by how they choose what McDonald's represents, or how they choose what the Gap represents as a manufacturer, a distributor of clothing, or potentially what Tesla represents, right? Or Ford. They're all playing in some aspects of a kind of emotional or affect politics. Makes me think of Protevi a little bit in terms of that notion of a kind of affect physiology almost attached to things that somehow that's moving into our corporations that are politicizing themselves, but emotionally politicizing themselves in some ways. Anybody else want to jump in here before we move on to the next theme?
Just very quickly, I've just been writing about Simondon and thinking about, the lockdown and our sort of relationships with technology, and Simondon writes really eloquently about this and sort of, kind of has this notion of individuation that, technology can help us in some way to kind of individuate, and these objects and our relationships with them, can be really positive in terms of sort of facilitating something new and bringing about some, greater kind of well-being for the world and for individuals, And of course, he talks about the dangers of it as well, and sort of, alienation that can come from the kind of technologies as well when they're sort of too controlled by large corporations, that comes from sort of digital capitalism, I suppose, that Caroline was talking about. But, I was also quite interested in sort of my relationship personally with technology throughout the lockdown and how that kind of really facilitated a lot of my work and sort of changed my work practices in a real kind of positive ways. And it was, it's been beautiful to sort of be able to go into people's front rooms and sort of engage with them much more effectively and in different kind of ways than I've ever kind of engaged with people before at work, sort of. I was hoping to hear Caroline's baby cry. You know, it'd be really nice, because I like that kind of, you know, that sensitivity that technology can bring to our lives, you know, and this kind of new way of communicating with each other. But of course, there's always this anxiety, isn't there, that, you know, that we are, our data's being captured, and in some way, you know, it's changing our behaviors in a negative kind of way, and digital platforms just want to increase kind of the stickiness of their platform, and so are manipulating the kind of black box of what I call our soul into kind of you know, forming more and more dangerous attachments with them. So, you know, just that really. But I think Sir Monden's really helpful to think through some of this, and he wrote some really nice he's written some really nice stuff, which is just recently being translated into English, you know, for those of us who don't speak French. So yeah.
I'm not sure why every time someone mentions those relationships between atmosphere and Simondon, I always somehow return to Brian Masumi. And I, you know, and not everybody knows this, but he was one of my supervisors of my PhD. But and it's just an interesting relationship that he has with atmosphere in his last works that he put out a few years ago, and how we construct values. But he does, and this is very close to Darren's notion, he does do an affirming notion, yes, kind of opposite of the political economy of capitalism, an affirming notion of a kind of different form of affective value that can be produced by a kind of relationship that is kind of like built from our technology, built from collective connections. I had this feeling that Tony wanted to speak, but I'm not positive about that. But maybe Mario, you seem to unmute yourself there as well. So jump in there if you want.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think this whole theme of capitalization upon affect or emotion is very interesting one and very relevant one. And I'm also thinking how our emotions or traces of our emotions become information and data for example, for transnational companies. So I think how to situate emotion in digital culture is it is so much about what goes beyond our intentions and our control. Yeah, that was it. Just briefly.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next theme. We'll get to it. And it's not, we may not talk about this as much, but let's look at some particular emotional performative structures. So emojis, hashtags, memes. Is there anything that you would want to say about how they are curating our emotion? Is there anything any of you would want to engage in terms of those things that are kind of affect translations and affect patterning that happens within digital culture and platforms? Anybody can jump in on this one, whatever you feel like.
I mean, I know other people here, of course, written about these topics. I think actually all of us have probably thought through them. I've written a little bit about hashtags and memes. I mean, I guess to kind of go between what Darren and kind of Mario have been talking about here. I mean, one reading of kind of, you know, hashtags and memes specifically is like politically, ethically, they just get subsumed back into the capitalist machine. They're generating the material for communicative capitalism. They are not real community or politics. They're kind of just this fuel to kind of oil the, you know, platform capitalism. But I guess, you know, more affirmatively in the work that I and others have been doing, you're thinking about, yes, what kind of patterning, relationality, collaboration is happening, for example, through the creation of memes. Memes actually are often not just kind of online or digital activities. They involve forms of crafting, making, collaboration that bring kind of online and offline together. They create political and social relations that didn't exist kind of necessarily before. There's a lot of interesting stuff written about kind of feminist politics of memes and humor, and queer as well. But also I think, you know, they're emergent. Same with hashtag politics. I mean, what's interesting to me, and I think what the forms of digital culture we have now make possible, despite their capitalist and other problematic kind of infrastructures, is they make possible a kind of emergent politics that's happening in the flow, I think, in a way that Musumi kind of foresees, you know, from the 1990s onwards. They're allowing us to follow particular events as they unfold in time, to kind of engage with change as it's happening in a certain way. Obviously, you know, that's being algorithmically curated and organized in certain ways, but I think there's something to hold on to there about the kind of unfolding politics in motion that we see through Black Lives Matter, that we, you know, saw earlier through Occupy in certain ways, that we're seeing in lots of different kinds of political projects and movements that are popping up now in intersectional kind of forms of engagement, that I think is really interesting and prevents us from just having the closure of this is only surveillance capitalism and nothing can exceed it.
Yeah, for me, it's also interesting how emoji overall, over its 15 years, has also become normalized and naturalized. So it's almost an emotional translation sort of thing, to take it away from a direct relationship to how you're feeling. And it's an interesting sort of thing. I think as soon as the movie came out, the children's movie, emoji kind of moved away from a common sort of relationship that I think Caroline has captured with memes and hashtags emerging from Twitter originally, informational, but also collectivizing, a collectivizing emotional sort of structure. But emoji is really interesting because it's almost like a linguistic transformation of emotion. And it doesn't deaden it, but it happifies it. I don't know what it is. Makes it, neutralizes it. I'm not sure. Anyway, anybody else want to come in with how those new kind of forms in online culture are playing out?
I'll probably just to add there. I mean, we're talking about data collection. I mean, you know, the like button I think was introduced, was it about 2007 or 8? It was quite late actually, probably even later than that. And obviously that's been quite an interesting way. But Facebook is collecting data about people, and you just got to see the kind of expansion in the last few years of those you know, emojis. The angry button, the love button, all those sort of things. Obviously, there's something going on there in terms of behavioural data collection. I know we can be quite cynical about how that's translated into you know, actual analysis of people's behaviour, but it's quite obvious that those things are part of a wider kind of marketing technique. That's all I really wanted to say.
It's also interesting, isn't it? Facebook in 2018 released some of their data, what they collected on sort of how people use emojis and emoticons, you know, and you know, of course, you know, companies have been really interested in sort of, you know, why someone would click on one emoji and not another one, and, you know, how can we make them more attractive and monetize them, etc., you know, which is all the kind of scary stuff. But even more scary, I think, was when they released this data, and I was interested to know what were the least popular emojis. You know, what ones aren't people using and why aren't they using them? And they can often tell us what's being used and what isn't being used, but they can't really tell a story beyond that. You know, I think that's left for the social scientists and the humanities to kind of think about. But the least popular one, right, was, I don't know if you know the man levitating, you know, emoji in a suit, which is kind of the old, I think it was Jerry Dammers who it was taken from his Specials album, a two-tone album, and it was actually of a guy called Peter Tosh, who was in Bob Marley and the Wailers, and he drew a picture of him. It became the album cover of the Specials, and it's a real icon. And then it was kind of taken and used as an emoticon or emoji. And now the levitating man that was turned white, right? Because Peter Tosh was black. And I think that was quite interesting. But of course, now you get emojis and emoticons that have different skin tone colors, right? And the least attractive emoji that was used was the black levitating man, you know, in the suit. But, you know, the white man was used quite often. And I don't know, I think that's something that sociologists and all the rest of us need to look at, you know, what's kind of going on here, why are some more attractive than others, and what's kind of been said about sort of this racial bias perhaps that's implicit in some of this stuff.
Yeah, Maurizio, you have your hand up, so I presume that means you want to jump in for a moment, do you?
Yes, I was also thinking about the case of Cambridge Analytica, where basically the information collected by social media were able to affect the political opinion of American citizens related to the election of the president. And in my opinion, this is a really useful case study to understand the purpose of data collected. If we speak about user experience, as already said, the human is at the center, no? It's a user-centered design. So improve quality of experience, provide better service, try to take care about the needs of the user as a person. If you have other kind of purposes, like for instance, manipulate his opinion, understand his preference, or to detect his personality, identify a profile of personality. So if he's an afraid person, you can affect his opinion much easier. It's a completely different purpose. In this case, in my opinion, the only thing that we can do is to think about the politics that can be applied to this data collection and data manipulation.
Okay.
What
Thank
do you think?
Marita. That's good. Let's move on to the next one. So this is a little close to Tony. This is the contagion, the mood synchrony sort of idea. It's interesting how people intersect and integrate their own emotional position in relational terms in digital settings. Digital mood synchrony is a way to read perhaps how we curate and correlate, but also there is something that plays into the grouping of social media feeds and prompts that are connected to past activities. So along with digital contagion, which is not necessarily negative movement of emotions, but does play in spaces of millions and billions of connections, these ideas help us understand digital culture and situation of emotion. So Tony, if you feel like it, you can jump into it to make sure it isn't contagion necessarily negatively, but it is the notion of how things move in a large scale. I was thinking one of the oddest things that's happened in the last month, just before you start on it, Tony, is I still can't work out why Squid Game had almost 500 million people going and watching a South Korean series. And it literally didn't matter where in the world, but 500 million, maybe even more than that, on Netflix. Just an interesting sort of phenomena that you rarely sort of see. And it's not really negative, but it is an interesting relationship, which isn't, I wouldn't say it's quite Gabriel Tard or Gustave Le Bon, but there's something about it that is connected to what people see as significant at a particular moment. In a way, this is connected to even Maurizio's notion of, the political dimensions of how something connects one to another, and we have different ways of doing it, whether it is the tools of online culture or something else. Tony.
Is what Tard does in terms of, he's spat with Durkheim. I mean, Durkheim was interested in sort of collective consciousness. It was quite a cognitive model, if you think about it, the emergence of a kind of cognitive excess once the sort of social, the collective came together. Whereas Tard, on the other hand, was interested in what he called unconscious association, which we've kind of translated now into sort of non-conscious collective dynamics, I suppose. And you can relate that directly, I think, to atmospheres, this kind of idea of affective atmospheres. And I mean, it was Nigel Thrift, I think, who probably made some connection between Tard and an affective contagion. And Todd used terms like radiation, and a lot of people have said, well, really, if you translate that to kind of Masumi, kind of like resonation, and then affect. So I think what Todd brought to sociology was an early affect theory. So that's interesting.
Maybe before Mario goes, because Mario's going to go fairly soon. Is there anything you wanted to say before you go, Mario, so that we could that relates to this? Because as far as I can see, Tony is drawing you in for a second. So even if it's 20 seconds, go ahead and pass it on to us about how this relates to things. This kind of notion of synchrony and contagion is definitely related to the atmospheric qualities as well. But it could be other directions that you want to take that.
Well, actually, my first thought was that, Tony, I'm going to read your work. Thank you very much for that. Sounds super interesting. I think in my work, I have written about atmospheres and affects a lot, but I think there's still so much that we don't know about the particularities of technologies and media and social media in the formation of those atmospheres and how they kind of spread between online and offline environments without kind of reproducing that kind of dichotomies. So I think I have more like open questions than any answers or comments. I'm sorry about that.
Perfectly okay, makes sense. I'm not just being emotionally appealing. I'm trying to do more than that. But let's move on. Now to map where we want to go further. It's not easy seeing where industry creates these forms of calibration of activity for promotions, advertising, alignment, and association. And in some ways, the wider objective of our work today is to connect to industry and industry expertise further with our insights and scholarship in a potential connected project. In other words, we're starting here. How would we go further in being valuable to industry, but also how do we get into the black box of industry that we don't, in fact, we can't easily talk to Facebook about how they're calibrating and correlating or algorithmically constructing. We can't talk to WeChat that easily about how they are shaping and surveilling. But we can, to a degree, or I hope we can, make this connection to industry about what's valuable about what we do for for industry itself. That it isn't all about one against another, but we can think about what would be the value to them and the value to us, relating industry and our experiences and our knowledge. So, Maurizio, of course, you're the closest to this, but how do we get into the industry black box further as researchers? I'll start with you, and then we'll open it up to others to talk about it as well.
Well, how do we get to industry? In my experience, I can see that industries are interested in taking advantage of emotions and the emotional reaction of their, of course, of their clients and user and so on. I would say that emotion can be like a reflection of the satisfaction of the end user or the client that is connected to industrial products or services. And for this reason is a key factor to keep on board your client or your user. So, in my opinion, industry should always try to take care about this. Of course, we know that the industry have the pressure to go for profits. However, users and clients together can guide industries in this process. It's not easy, it's not simple, but I would like to show this example. One of my studies was about emotional reaction related to green topics. So I was studying the packaging of this yogurt, and we had 3 yogurts organic and 3 yogurts normal. When the organic yogurt was showing the green label of organic agriculture, it was rated as more pleasant or more preferable. However, when we were able to divide the sample between people interested in organic issues and people not interested, we saw in the eye tracking data that the people interested in organic agriculture was watching at that label quite a lot, while the people that was not interested didn't see any detail about this label. So what I understood from that project, that the education of the user, either the client, can enhance the behavior of industry and corporates. Let's imagine that all client or all user would be paying attention to this kind of information. They could become more critic or expert consumers. Probably if they all choose only organic products, they could shape industrial and corporate behavior. So this might be like a way to wrap up everything and probably take care about the potential risk of, of this huge amount of information provided to industry and corporates and the use they do about that.
Okay, thanks, Maurizio. What do other people think about the black box and how us as scholars, in a sense, can connect further into that territory, the industry black box in this area? Anybody have any thoughts about this? I know they can be positive or negative, but how would we do this? I think as a project, it would be interesting to explore that further. Ian, did you look like you're unmuted?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it depends, doesn't it, on the industry and the partner and the specific kind of where they're at in designing their kind of product or service or whatever it is. So in fact, Tony and Darren and I and PhD student sort of had a brief discussion about this a couple of weeks ago, and I've done some work with the mental health charity in the UK, Mind, on a social media platform. It's kind of social media, sort of an online peer support community. And I think that was reasonably successful, I think, in that what was good was they just launched it. So they were really interested in, they were comfortable with any kind of, suggestions for improvement about how it might not be working properly and things like that, because or how it wasn't working as optimally as it might be, because then they could improve the kind of the product, if we're going to use that term. So I think that worked quite well, and from a academic perspective, we want to publish. Yeah, let's be straight about this. We want it to be able to publish the research and things like that. So that's important, and so that's one of the challenges I think with industry, is whether they're be happy with who owns the data and stuff for publication purposes. But I think that worked because it was quite early in the product design, and I think that's if you're working with a company or something, if they're in sort of early stages, I think that can work better. Maybe it'll be more easy to kind of find a kind of mutually agreeable kind of partnership there than maybe it is a bit further down the line, because we'll often we'll have a different set of concerns, obviously, than an industry partner would have. So and you want to be able to publish your research, whatever the research finds. So it's how you manage the potential constraints on what might happen with it
it was interesting
what they hear.
Yeah, it was interesting reading Maurizio's work there and getting that sense of, can we construct environments that would be intriguing for industry to sort of understand what is going on as well, even if we're not attached to the companies that we're looking at. and we could critique it. We could you know, put all sorts of dimensions of critical theoretical, political notions around it. But I think it's really important to make a project of some sort that attaches us to at least, at minimum, the process of interviewing what industry is involved with. Now, Darren, you had a recent experience with North American industry connections. What would you add to that? What would you say?
I mean, one of the things that they seem to be quite concerned about, and I mean, there's a lot of digital platforms that were involved in this meeting that I had, a kind of round table, and it's an ongoing thing that was facilitated by Aspen Digital. And you know, I think that their concern is that they're being now recognized. It's been recognized that using these platforms are not always beneficial for people, and they're interested in well-being. Right? How can we measure well-being? You know, and what does it mean for people, and what does it mean for different people, and what are the different measures of it, and what do we think about well-being? Because, you know, they're being perceived as decreasing people's well-being, and you know, they want to sort of tap into social sciences kind of research that we're doing in relation to sort of thinking through some of the issues that maybe negatively affect people when using these platforms. But it's really difficult because, you know, they're always up against this, trying to please their shareholders and the advertisers, you know, and you know, and I felt that that was a real kind of bridge that they couldn't negotiate properly, and so they sort of turned the conversation to, well, look at all the beneficial things that we are including in our platform. For example, Facebook, you know, with all these sort of little self-help groups and stuff where we are helping people's well-being. But, you know, fundamentally, their model is not helping people's well-being. But I think there is something we can do there. Personally, I think, you know, social scientists to sort of help them think through these issues. But whether they're going to listen to us or not is another thing, isn't it?
I feel like how we engage with industry, especially, you know, some of these major corporations, also depends on how we understand the nature of the black box. So you can think about the black box, obviously, in terms of like ownership of data and kind of the algorithms used, which, you know, like Google and Facebook are like super secretive about kind of how exactly they are harvesting data in particular ways.
Yeah,
but,
and they've moved
you know,
into it being like intellectual property that they kind of own, which is an interesting relationship they have to billions.
And it goes back to what Tony said earlier about like, well, what do we mean when we say user? Because we're actually providing all the raw data, which we don't own. So we're not exactly users or clients in that way. I mean, the clients are the advertisers are the people buying the prediction products. So it's I think it's important to think about like, what do we mean by user in this context if we're engaging with industry? But also like thinking,
is it worthwhile thinking of fabricating a version of what goes on in industry? In other words, we're not making it for monetary gain. We're just playing with some of the conventions there. I know that, you know, when what was it, the Scandinavian group that was dealing with Spotify, they tried to set up a version of a music sort of structure just to see how it goes through. But is there something to be done with setting up variations of how different kinds of emotions are calibrated, correlated, algorithmically constructed? Is that worthwhile? So should we be dealing with maybe some computer scientists that are less connected to the industry itself to build into our network as well?
I was speaking to somebody who worked in industry the other day, and we're talking about trust and sort of, you know, social trust and that kind of stuff, right? You know, and he said, we've got 700 people working on trust. It's like they have a lot of researchers, you know, and so it's quite difficult to tap into them because they've got so much money that they've, you know, oh, we're interested in trust, we're going to hire 700 people to sort of, I don't know, do this, that, and the other around it. So it's, they have got an abundance of researchers, you know, so that's a difficulty as well, isn't it?
I know Carolyn had to go. it's been a really rewarding experience. I don't think we can finish everything today. I don't want to wreck your Fridays completely or make you only think about this. But I think we've gone through an amazing amount of thought and knowledge. Darren and Ian, do you want to say anything before we head off?
No, not necessarily. Just to say that, just to thank everyone for participating in sort of that, really kind of fruitful discussion. I know there's sort of lots of thoughts going in my head. I'm sure it is for everyone. So yeah, no, just to repeat over what you say, we'll have a follow-up kind of chat and conversation. Then we'll be in touch with people about thinking about the best way to take it forward.
All right, we better let you go. You should enjoy your Fridays. Thanks again, guys. I don't want to overdo it, but we went long.
Thank you. Thank you
for all
to
that.
everybody, guys.
We'll definitely be dealing with this.
Good to see you all. Thanks, Janie. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Cheers.
Okay,
Thank you,
bye-bye.
David.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.